I'm Reagan Lewis, a 38-year-old corporate lawyer living in my penthouse in downtown Chicago. This apartment isn't just a place to sleep. It's the symbol of years of relentless work, countless late nights, and sacrifices only I fully understand. Every sleek, modern corner of this place tells a story of determination. The floor-to-ceiling windows that frame the city skyline, the minimalist decor I painstakingly curated, and the quiet sanctuary where I retreat after the chaos of both the courtroom and my family life. For as long as I can remember, I've been the dependable daughter, the one who keeps everything running smoothly behind the scenes. While my sister Olivia lounges through life without a care, I'm the one who handles the family's legal troubles, finances, and sometimes even the messy personal dramas that inevitably surface. I've always taken it on with quiet resolve, believing that if I just kept the peace, things would eventually settle in a way that felt fair. But that peace has always been fragile, like glass barely held together by thin strips of tape. Family gatherings, which should be moments of warmth and connection, have instead become tense affairs where smiles are forced and words are weighted. Tonight's party was no different, yet something inside me had shifted by the time the evening unraveled. The room buzzed with the hum of polite conversation and clinking glasses. Around 30 guests filled the grand hall of our parents' sprawling suburban home, a mix of relatives, family friends, and a few of Olivia's acquaintances. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the faint tang of hors d'oeuvres. Everyone seemed to be watching, waiting for something to happen, and I felt the weight of their eyes like a silent jury. It started when Dad, a man whose pride and ego are as large as his business empire, cleared his throat with an unmistakable sharpness. His posture was rigid, his eyes fixed on me with a cold, unyielding intensity. "Reagan," he said, voice low but carrying clearly across the room. "It's time you hand over the penthouse keys to Olivia. She needs a place of her own, and it's only right that family shares." A hush fell. My breath caught. The penthouse, this sanctuary I'd built with my own hands and hours, suddenly felt like a prize being torn from my grasp, right there in front of everyone. The shock registered on the faces around me. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, others stifled gasps. Olivia, sitting smugly on the sidelines, barely hid her smirk. I kept my voice steady, though my heart hammered. "Dad, that's not acceptable. The penthouse is mine. I've worked hard for it. Olivia has other options." He sneered, dismissive. "You think this is about what's acceptable? Family comes first, Reagan. You don't get to hold on to your things selfishly while Olivia struggles." I could feel the tension crackle like electricity between us. I tried to reason, to appeal to what little sense of fairness I thought he had. But the room was no longer listening to me. It was a performance, and I was the unwilling actor. Then, in a moment that shattered everything, Dad's hand shot out and struck me across the face. The slap was so sudden, so violent, that my earring caught the force of it and flew off, clattering loudly on the polished floor. The sound was deafening, a sharp punctuation that silenced the room completely. Shock and disbelief rippled through the guests. I stood frozen for a heartbeat, my cheek burning and throat tight. The air felt thick, suffocating. I could hear Ethan's voice somewhere behind me, my husband, the steady anchor in my storm, uttering something stunned and angry, but I couldn't process his words. All I knew was that the moment my calm shattered, so did the fragile illusion of family harmony. Without another word, I turned and walked away from the crowd, from Dad's furious glare, from Olivia's smug expression. I needed air, space, anything to keep from breaking down right there in front of everyone. My hand instinctively went to my ear, touching the spot where the earring had been. I pulled out my phone and stared at the screen, my mind racing. The calm, obedient daughter was gone, replaced by someone who understood that this night was a turning point. The keys to the penthouse were more than metal and plastic. They were a symbol of my independence, my hard work, and everything I wasn't willing to surrender. And as I stood there, heart pounding, I realized that what happened tonight wasn't just a family argument. It was something much darker, and it demanded a response I was only beginning to comprehend. This wasn't new. The dynamic between Olivia and me had been etched into the fabric of our family since we were kids. long before I understood just how unfair it really was. Olivia was the golden child, the sun around which the rest of us orbited. She had this effortless charm that seemed to disarm everyone, our parents, relatives, teachers, even the neighbors. Somehow her missteps were always excused, forgiven, or quietly swept under the rug, as if her mistakes were tiny cracks in an otherwise perfect facade, while mine were gaping chasms demanding immediate repair. I remember when we were teenagers, Olivia could stay out late without consequence, her curfew extended with a smile and a shrug. Meanwhile, I was expected to be home on time, to care for the younger cousins when family gatherings spilled into long evenings, to take on chores that no one else wanted. If I voiced frustration or asked for help, it was dismissed as whining or an overreaction. But when Olivia did the same, our parents would rush to her aid, often bending rules or making exceptions just for her. The disparity only grew worse as we got older. When Olivia racked up credit card debt her first year after college, Dad swooped in like a financial rescue helicopter, cutting checks, calling creditors, smoothing everything over without a word of reprimand. I was the one left to clean up the mess behind the scenes, often sacrificing my own time and resources to keep the family's reputation intact. But when I faced my own financial setbacks, requests for even minor assistance were met with silence or thinly veiled rebukes about responsibility and self-reliance. I used to tell myself it was just family dynamics, a phrase that sounded reasonable, but was really just a euphemism for favoritism disguised as tradition. At every holiday, every birthday, every event where we gathered, the script played out the same way. I was the reliable one, the adult who kept things running. Olivia was the cherished daughter whose mistakes were glossed over, and Mom and Dad were the judges who always seemed to side with her. Mom especially had a way of twisting words that made me doubt myself. She'd say things like, "Olivia has had a harder time finding her path, Reagan. You've always been so strong, and we're so proud of you for carrying the family." It sounded like praise, but beneath it was a message I couldn't ignore, that my strength was expected, even demanded, while Olivia's struggles needed protection. I learned to swallow my resentment, to carry my burden silently, because rocking the boat only made things worse. I wasn't blind to how this affected Olivia either. She was bright and capable in many ways, but the constant enabling had made her dependent and complacent. Instead of pushing herself to succeed, she relied on the cushions provided by our parents, and by me. I paid her rent more times than I can count. I covered her car expenses. I even helped with legal advice when she tangled with landlords or credit agencies. Every time I hoped it would be the last, that she'd finally take a step toward independence. But the pattern repeated itself, like a revolving door of entitlement. And through it all, Dad's stance never wavered. He told me that family means sacrifice, and that I should put Olivia's needs first. His words were like chains I carried, invisible, but heavy. When I questioned why his help was so uneven, he'd deflect, accusing me of ingratitude or coldness. There was no room for negotiation, only orders dressed up as family wisdom. I often found myself caught in the crossfire between my parents' expectations and Olivia's demands. Trying to keep the peace meant hiding my frustration, swallowing my pride, and convincing myself that love required sacrifice, even when it hurt. It was exhausting. I was the one who gave, who compromised, who lost parts of myself while the rest of the family stayed comfortably afloat. Looking back, it's clear that the imbalance wasn't just about money or favors. It was about control, an unspoken power dynamic where my worth was measured by what I could provide, not by who I was. Olivia was allowed to lean on others, to take without giving. I was expected to hold everything together, no matter the cost. That toxic pattern shaped every family gathering, every interaction. It created a simmering resentment beneath the surface, a quiet war I fought alone. I became an expert at masking my pain behind smiles and polite words, hoping that someday the scales would tip, that fairness would finally win out. But the truth was, fairness never had a seat at our family table. The golden child status wasn't going anywhere. The sacrifices were mine to make, forever. And that's why the demand to hand over my penthouse keys wasn't just greedy or misguided. It was the latest, most blatant reminder that my family had never truly respected my boundaries or my worth. It was the moment when the facade cracked wide open, revealing the harsh reality I'd been living with for so long. Tonight, the golden child's throne was within reach, and I was expected to step aside without protest, just like I always had. Over the years, my quiet sacrifices became the invisible foundation holding up our fractured family. I wasn't just the one who drafted wills or handled property disputes behind closed doors. I was the financial safety net, the unpaid counselor, the late-night crisis manager for Olivia's endless string of problems. At first, I told myself I was doing it for love, for family. But deep down, I knew it was more complicated, more like a never-ending exchange where I gave, and nothing was ever truly reciprocated. I remember one particularly harsh winter when Olivia lost her job. Again, she called me in tears, panicked about her rent, the mounting bills, the fear of eviction. Without hesitation, I transferred money to her account, covering her rent and groceries for 3 months. The relief in her voice was immediate, but so was the sense of obligation I felt, like I had just plugged a leak in a dam ready to burst. There was no gratitude, no promise to change, just a quiet expectation that I'd be there next time. And there always was a next time. It wasn't just the money. When Mom fell seriously ill 2 years ago with a chronic condition that made daily living a struggle, I delayed a promotion I'd been working toward for years. The job was in London, a dream opportunity, the kind of career move most lawyers would jump at without hesitation, but I couldn't leave. Mom needed me, and so did the tangled mess of family responsibilities that fell largely on my shoulders. I stayed behind, putting my career on pause to coordinate her care, appointments, and family legal matters. Ethan, my rock through everything, urged me to reconsider, but I felt trapped by duty and guilt. Meanwhile, Olivia barely lifted a finger during Mom's illness. She showed up sometimes, but mostly to complain about how stressful it was for her. I remember one weekend when I came home after a 14-hour day at the firm to find Olivia streaming a reality show in the living room, unbothered, while Mom was upstairs struggling with her medications. I swallowed my frustration because confrontation never helped, but the sting of unfairness was sharp and persistent. I also recall the time I bought Olivia a car, a brand new sedan. It wasn't just a gift. I thought it might be the push she needed to finally start taking responsibility for herself. The surprise on her face was brief before it melted into entitlement, as if this car was her rightful due rather than a help from me. She never once asked how much it cost or thanked me genuinely. Instead, she used it without care, skipping routine maintenance and leaving me to cover repairs when the inevitable breakdowns happened. It was an expensive mistake, but like so many others, I buried the disappointment under a layer of hope that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. I often found myself juggling multiple roles: financial provider, emotional buffer, legal advisor, while trying to maintain a sense of normalcy in my own life. Each favor, each sacrifice chipped away at my sense of self, but I convinced myself that this was what family meant, that my giving was the glue holding us together. Even Ethan, who always supported me, sometimes struggled to understand how deep this went. He'd ask gently, "Why don't you just say no? Why do you keep enabling her?" And I'd answer with practiced calm, "Because if I don't, everything falls apart." But inside, I knew the truth was darker. I was terrified of losing my family's fragile peace, even if it meant losing myself. Looking back now, I see how every delayed promotion, every rent check, every legal consultation was a thread in a web designed to keep me tethered and tethering others, while Olivia drifted freely, shielded by parental favoritism and my own unwillingness to push back. My sacrifices were met not with gratitude, but with expectation. My boundaries ignored and overstepped. And yet, despite it all, I kept hoping that the next party, the next conversation, the next gesture of goodwill might finally balance the scales, that Olivia might find her footing, and we could finally be equals, not caretaker and dependent. But that hope was a fragile illusion, one I clung to even as it slipped further from reach. Tonight's demand, for me to hand over my penthouse keys, was the brutal culmination of years of imbalanced giving. It wasn't just about property or money. It was the family's way of telling me, once again, that my worth was tied only to what I provided, and that my dreams, my hard work, my boundaries meant nothing in the face of their entitlement. And in that moment, I realized something had to change. Because no matter how many times I gave, no matter how much I sacrificed, this pattern wasn't going to fix itself. It never had. Last year's Christmas party was supposed to be joyful, a rare chance for our sprawling, fractious family to gather under one roof, share a meal, and maybe, just maybe, let the weight of everyday grievances ease for a few hours. Instead, it became one of the most humiliating nights of my life, a moment etched deep into my memory, where my mother's words struck louder than any clash or raised voice ever had. I remember walking into the festively decorated living room, the scent of pine mingling with cinnamon and roasted chestnuts drifting in from the kitchen. The soft glow of twinkling lights draped over the mantelpiece cast gentle shadows on the faces of relatives, some eager to reconnect, others nursing old wounds beneath practiced smiles. I was wearing a dress I'd carefully chosen, a subtle, elegant navy blue that made me feel put together, professional, and, in that moment, hopeful that things might be different. But that hope was fragile, like the thin glass ornaments hanging from the tree. Beautiful, yes, but prone to shattering with the slightest disturbance. Mom had been unusually vocal that evening, her laughter a little too sharp, her compliments layered with barbs. The party was in full swing when, during the opening toast, she raised her glass and said, "To family," in a voice that was warm on the surface. Then, just as the clinking noise settled, she pivoted her gaze directly at me and said loud enough for half the room to hear, "You know, Reagan, sometimes I wonder what Olivia would be without her natural charm. She's the real success in this family, not you." The words hit me like a fist wrapped in velvet. There was a flicker of stunned silence, like everyone was waiting for a punchline that never came. My heart stuttered, and I felt the blood drain from my face. I forced myself to smile, the kind of smile that hides everything: hurt, disbelief, the sting of betrayal, and nodded politely. But inside, my chest tightened, breath catching in a way that didn't quite feel like surprise anymore. This was just another round in the never-ending battle of being invisible despite all I'd done. Mom continued, undeterred by the shifting atmosphere. "Olivia has a way with people. A gift. She knows how to make life easy. You, Reagan, you work so hard, but sometimes it feels like you forget the importance of connection and grace." She glanced around, as if expecting the room to erupt in agreement. Dad chimed in from his usual place near the fireplace, swirling his drink with a slow, deliberate motion. "It's just a job to her," he said dismissively, nodding toward me. "Nothing to write home about. Olivia's got that spark you can't teach. That's what counts in life." I swallowed the lump in my throat and tried to steady my voice. "I think success looks different to everyone, Dad. And hard work is part of that too." The room was watching now, not with sympathy, but with an uncomfortable curiosity, as if witnessing a spectacle rather than a conversation. Some relatives shifted in their seats, others exchanged quick glances, and I could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on me. Olivia, sitting nearby with her arms crossed and a smirk barely hidden, caught my eye just long enough to send a silent message. "You'll never win this." Her aura of entitlement was palpable, as if my accomplishments were mere obstacles in her path rather than earned milestones. Mom's voice dropped just a fraction, but the venom was unmistakable. "You always think you're the responsible one, the adult. But sometimes being responsible means knowing when to step back and let others shine." She laughed lightly, a sound that felt hollow and rehearsed. "Maybe that's why Olivia is thriving, and you're just so busy trying to prove yourself all the time." The echo of her words hung in the room. I felt my hands clench involuntarily at my sides, nails digging into my palms as the sharp edges of shame and anger collided inside me. The family I'd devoted myself to, the people I'd supported through every crisis, had reduced me to a footnote, a cautionary tale about being too serious, too hard on myself. It wasn't just the words, it was the public nature of the humiliation. in front of cousins who barely knew me, in front of family friends who had witnessed my sacrifices but never acknowledged them. My worth was being erased. I was the invisible daughter, the one who always gave but was never truly seen. Ethan, standing beside me, caught my eye and gave a small, reassuring nod. His presence was a balm, but even he seemed momentarily stunned by the sharpness of Mom's attack. I wanted to say something, to defend myself, to demand respect, but the words lodged in my throat. Instead, I nodded again, forcing a polite smile that felt like a mask slipping under pressure. Throughout the evening, Mom kept weaving her narrative, comparing me unfavorably to Olivia in subtle and not-so-subtle ways, praising Olivia's charm at the dinner table, remarking on how she had so much potential, despite a lack of steady employment, while suggesting I was too serious or overburdened. Each comment was a calculated chip away at my confidence and standing. I realized then that these moments weren't accidental outbursts, but part of a pattern, a performance where Mom played the protector of the golden child, and I was the perpetual outsider, the scapegoat for family tension. My accomplishments, my sacrifices, all invisible behind the curtain of favoritism. The night ended with polite farewells, but the damage was done. I went home carrying a heavy heart, the sting of humiliation sharper than any cold winter wind outside. The family wasn't just divided by love and resentment, it was fractured by the refusal to acknowledge truth, fairness, or respect. That Christmas, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my penthouse, I understood something fundamental. My family didn't just fail to celebrate my success, they actively undermined it. And no matter how much I gave, how much I tried to keep peace, I was never going to be the daughter they truly valued. The realization was painful, but it planted a seed, one that would grow into resolve. Because if my place in the family was to be defined by invisible sacrifices and public humiliation, then I needed to start defining myself on my own terms. This year's family party was supposed to be just another routine gathering, the same polished smiles and strained niceties I'd endured countless times before. But that night, beneath the surface of polite conversation and clinking glasses, the tension simmered in a way I hadn't quite anticipated. The room was filled with familiar faces, relatives exchanging pleasantries, neighbors nodding politely, and the usual array of family friends who'd heard the stories but never truly understood the undercurrents of our fractured family. The grand suburban home was warm and inviting, the scent of roast beef and fresh herbs mingling with subtle notes of expensive cologne and perfume. Outside, the December chill pressed against the windows, but inside, the ambiance was carefully curated to project unity and celebration. Yet, as the evening progressed, it felt less like a party and more like an arena. I sensed the quiet anticipation in the air, as if everyone was waiting for something to ignite. That something came when Dad, tall and imposing in his tailored navy suit, cleared his throat with a deliberate firmness that sucked the room's noise into a hush. His eyes locked onto me with an intensity that felt like a spotlight, isolating me from the crowd. "Reagan," he said, voice low but resolute, "it's time you hand over the penthouse keys to Olivia. She needs a place of her own, and it's only right that family shares." The words hit me like a gut punch. My chest tightened, breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just a casual suggestion, it was a command. Right there, in front of nearly 30 people, Dad was demanding I surrender the home that symbolized every ounce of my hard work, the place where I found solace after long, grueling days. The penthouse wasn't just property. It was my achievement, my sanctuary, my independence. I glanced around, noticing the expressions on the faces gathered. Some guests exchanged uneasy looks. Others shifted in their seats, their polite smiles faltering. Olivia, perched smugly on a velvet-upholstered chair near the fireplace, barely contained a smirk that screamed entitlement. Her eyes sparkled with triumph, as though this moment had been scripted for her benefit. I forced my voice to remain steady, though my heart thundered in my ears. "Dad, that's not acceptable. The penthouse is mine. I've worked hard for it. Olivia has other options." I tried to inject reason into the conversation, to appeal to fairness, but my words seemed to dissolve in the charged silence. Dad's lips curled into a sneer. His tone sharpened. "You think this is about what's acceptable? Family comes first, Reagan. You don't get to hold on to your things selfishly while Olivia struggles." The room felt like it tightened around me, the weight of his accusation pressing down like a physical force. His words were less a statement and more an ultimatum, an assertion of control disguised as family loyalty. I could feel the room's energy shift, like an electric current crackling between us. I opened my mouth to respond, to defend the countless sacrifices I'd made for this family, but the space for dialogue had vanished. This was no longer a conversation. It was a performance for an audience that had been primed to witness my capitulation. Then, without warning, Dad's hand shot out, striking me across the face with a force that stunned me into silence. The slap was sharp and sudden, a violent punctuation that echoed through the room. My earring caught the full impact, tearing free and clattering like a gunshot on the glossy hardwood floor. The sound was deafening in the stunned silence that followed. Time seemed to freeze. Shock rippled through the crowd. Some gasped. Others stared wide-eyed, mouths slightly agape. I stood motionless, my cheek burning from the sting, my mind reeling from the betrayal. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with disbelief and discomfort. Somewhere behind me, I heard Ethan's voice, low and urgent. "Dad? What the hell?" But the noise barely penetrated my whirlwind of shock and hurt. My heart pounded, adrenaline surging as the fragile mask of calm I'd worn shattered completely. Olivia's smirk widened, her eyes gleaming with vindication as if she'd orchestrated the moment. Mom, ever the peacemaker with a knack for rationalizing the unreasonable, moved quickly to smooth things over, her voice a forced whisper. "Reagan, you must understand. Your father's actions come from a place of concern. Family is everything." But her words rang hollow. A thin veil stretched over the raw wound left by Dad's violence. I didn't respond. Instead, I turned on my heel, every muscle taut, and walked away from the gathering. I left behind the stares, the murmurs, the suffocating expectations. Outside the room, the cool air brushed against my flushed face, a small but welcome contrast to the heat of humiliation burning within me. My fingers instinctively reached up to my ear, touching the bare spot where my earring had been ripped away, an unmistakable symbol of the violence inflicted not just on my body, but on my spirit. My phone, cold and familiar in my palm, felt like the last tether to the world where I still had control. I took a deep breath, steadying the rapid beat of my heart. This was no longer about enduring family drama or sacrificing for peace. This was a crossroads. The fractured illusion of family harmony lay in ruins, and I was left with a profound realization. I could no longer trust those who claimed to love me when their love came with such cruelty and demands. The room behind me remained thick with tension, the murmurs growing louder, but I had already stepped beyond the threshold of submission. The Penthouse keys were more than a set of metal and plastic. They were a symbol of my autonomy, my years of effort, and everything I refused to relinquish. As I stood alone, my mind raced with what needed to come next. This night was a fracture in the family's foundation, a moment of undeniable betrayal that demanded a response, not just for me, but for the dignity I was determined to reclaim. The hallway outside the grand party room was cool and quiet, an immediate contrast to the suffocating heat of humiliation I'd just escaped. I leaned against the polished wall, my cheek still stinging from Dad's slap, the sharp absence of my earring a raw, physical reminder of the night's violence. The muffled voices and clinking glasses drifted behind the closed door, but I felt utterly alone, as if I'd stepped through a veil separating the world I thought I knew from something darker and more unsettling. My mind churned, racing through the decades of twisted family history that had led to this moment. It wasn't just tonight. It was every time I'd swallowed my pride, every time I'd been the family's invisible backbone while Olivia's entitled demands were met with indulgence. The sacrifices I'd made had been countless and invisible. Money lent, time given, dreams deferred, all met with expectation rather than gratitude. A wave of grief swelled inside me. Grief not just for the immediate pain, but for all the years I'd lost being seen and respected as my own person. I thought of the promotions I'd passed up, the late nights spent untangling my sister's messes, the countless times I'd bitten my tongue during family dinners to avoid another argument. That grief quickly hardened into a simmering anger at the unfairness, at the blatant favoritism, and at the physical violence inflicted by a man who should have been my protector. But beneath the raw emotion, a new, sharper clarity began to take hold. I saw the pattern spreading before me, like a malignant vine choking everything in its path. I was the family's bank, their lawyer, their emotional punching bag. I was the one who kept the fragile family machine running, while they took and took, never acknowledging the cost. The realization was like a cold shard lodged deep inside me. I owed them nothing. No longer would I be the silent martyr, the one who absorbed their entitlement and dismissed abuses. The penthouse, my achievements, my boundaries, these were mine. My body, my dignity, my hard-earned success were not up for negotiation or theft. I thought back to the countless moments when I'd rationalized their behavior, convincing myself it was just how families are. But tonight shattered that illusion. The slap wasn't just a physical blow. It was a symbol, a brutal punctuation mark. To all the times my boundaries were ignored, my worth dismissed, and my love taken for granted, a quiet resolve began to form, steady and unyielding. I wouldn't let this moment define me as a victim. Instead, I would transform it into a turning point. For the first time, I embraced the idea that protecting myself wasn't selfish, it was necessary. That self-respect meant setting firm lines, allowing consequences to follow, and refusing to be complicit in my own erasure. The room beyond remained alive with whispers and shocked murmurs, but I no longer felt tethered to their judgment. The calm, obedient daughter who kept peace at the cost of her soul was gone, replaced by someone who understood that boundaries weren't just words, but shields, vital defenses against a family culture that had long devalued her. I pulled my phone from my pocket and stared at its glowing screen. It was more than a device. It was a tool, a weapon, and a lifeline. For years, I'd documented these injustices quietly, saving emails, recording conversations, gathering proof. Now, I realized those records were the foundation of the power I was about to reclaim. Fingers trembling slightly, I scrolled through messages and notes, evidence of financial handouts, texts from Olivia asking for yet another favor, snippets of recorded conversations where Dad's control and aggression were laid bare, the penthouse deed, legal papers, the wills I'd drafted. It was all here. All the armor I needed to stand my ground. Finally, breathing deep, I felt the tide of emotions settle into a sharp focus. The night's betrayal had awakened a fierce determination that would not be quenched. No longer would I be defined by their entitlement, their manipulation, or their violence. I would fight, not with anger alone, but with clear, deliberate action aimed at reclaiming my dignity and autonomy. Tonight marked the end of silent suffering. It was the beginning of measured consequences, firm boundaries, and an unbreakable defense of everything I'd built with my own hands. As the distant murmur of the party continued, I wiped a tear from my cheek, squared my shoulders, and stepped forward into a new chapter, one where I was no longer just a daughter, but a woman who refused to be broken. I retreated to the quiet sanctuary of my penthouse, the very place Dad had demanded I surrender to Olivia. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Chicago skyline, twinkling like distant stars, beautiful, but unreachable. The contrast between this calm and the chaos of the party was stark. My cheek still throbbed where Dad's hand had struck me, and the empty space where my earring once dangled was a cruel reminder of how deeply the night had cut into my dignity. But within that sting, a new resolve took root. I knew I couldn't simply endure this abuse and betrayal anymore. I had to fight back, but smartly. I was a lawyer after all, and that meant I could wield the law and evidence as weapons, tools to protect what was mine and to finally put an end to the exploitation. So I began gathering evidence, methodically, quietly, like building a fortress brick by brick. The first step was tapping into the countless recordings I'd made over the years. Dad's temper was volatile, And I'd learned early on that having a record was the only way to shield myself. Hidden audio snippets from phone calls and family conversations captured his verbal abuse, the moments where he wielded his authority like a weapon, and the times when his words turned cruel and controlling. The slap from tonight, while unrecorded live, was part of a larger pattern that I was now documenting more rigorously than ever. Next, I dove into the financial records I kept meticulously: spreadsheets, bank statements, transfers, and receipts that painted a clear picture of how much I'd supported Olivia over time: rent payments, car repairs, emergency bailouts for credit card debts, and even the multiple legal consultations I'd provided pro bono. The numbers were staggering, a silent testament to a one-sided support system that had long been taken for granted. I also reviewed and secured all the legal documents related to the penthouse: the deed, mortgage papers, insurance policies, and, most importantly, titled ownership papers. I double-checked every clause, every signature, ensuring that the property was legally and unequivocally mine. There was no loophole for Dad or Olivia to exploit. I contacted my trusted real estate attorney friend, someone who'd known me since law school, to discuss tightening protections like irrevocable trusts and revisiting my will. I wanted to make certain that the penthouse and my other assets were beyond their reach. While compiling this evidence, I was mindful to keep my demeanor normal around family events. I couldn't let anyone catch wind of my plans. So in public, I maintained the calm, collected lawyer persona: polite nods, measured smiles, professional responses. I was the daughter they recognized, the one who always had her act together, the one who never showed weakness. But beneath that surface, I was setting my trap. I also began researching protective orders and restraining mechanisms. Knowing that Dad's abusive behavior could escalate, I consulted online legal resources and reached out to support groups discreetly. My mind pictured scenarios where I might need to impose legal boundaries, not just financial or property-related, but personal safety ones. It was a cold, calculated preparation born from years of emotional turmoil. I realized self-protection wasn't weakness, it was survival. Simultaneously, I started organizing all the evidence into a secure digital folder, encrypted and backed up on multiple devices: emails, text messages from Olivia pleading for funds, voicemails from Dad's angry tirades, photographs of the penthouse, and scanned copies of all legal agreements. This dossier was my shield and my sword. If confrontation came again, I would be ready to not only defend myself, but expose the truth. Each night, as I reviewed another set of documents or listened to a painful recording, a strange sensation emerged, a mix of sadness, anger, and empowerment. The sadness for how long this had gone on unnoticed or unchallenged, the anger at the years of betrayal and abuse, but most importantly, the empowerment of reclaiming control over my narrative, my property, and my dignity. I also began drafting potential statements, careful, legal-sounding phrases that could be used if I had to confront the family publicly or in court. I practiced my tone, making sure it was firm but not emotional, precise but not mean-spirited. I wanted to communicate boundaries clearly and with authority, so there would be no room for manipulation or misinterpretation. In this planning phase, I felt a shift within myself. The years of silent endurance had forged me into a strategist. I was no longer just the family's lawyer or caretaker. I was an advocate for my own rights and well-being. The penthouse symbolized that transformation. It was my hard-earned independence, and now it was the cornerstone of my stand against a toxic legacy. Despite the painstaking work, there was an undercurrent of anxiety. I knew the family wouldn't take kindly to my new stance. Dad's pride and temper were legendary, and Olivia's entitlement was fierce. The battle ahead would be more than legal. It would be personal and public. But now, armed with facts, law, and evidence, I was ready to face whatever came next. I made a silent promise to myself as I closed my laptop late one night, the city lights twinkling below. No more silence, no more sacrifices to please the ungrateful. This was my home, my life, my boundary, and I was prepared to defend it, no matter the cost. I started pulling back slowly but deliberately, like a tide receding before a storm. The first thing I did was stop lending money. It wasn't a dramatic announcement. Just silence when Olivia called asking for her usual help. No excuses, no justifications. Just a firm, steady refusal that shocked her into silence. I remember the first time she begged me to cover a late rent payment, her voice trembling with fake desperation. I simply said, "Olivia, I can't. No more transfers. No more covering her debts." The money stopped flowing, and with it, the expectation that I was an endless resource. That was harder than I ever anticipated. Olivia didn't respond with gratitude or understanding. Instead, I felt the shift in her attitude almost immediately, a simmering resentment disguised as entitlement. But I had to remind myself, I wasn't responsible for fixing her life anymore. She had to stand on her own 2 feet. I also declined any caregiving duties for Mom. I used to be the one coordinating her appointments, running errands, and managing medications. When she called, worried and confused, I gently explained that I had to focus on my work and personal healing now. It wasn't cruelty. It was survival. Mom's calls became less frequent, and I felt a pang of guilt twist inside me, but it was tempered by years of silent sacrifice that had brought me to this breaking point. I couldn't be the family's nursemaid any longer. Reducing contact with my family was the most emotionally taxing step. I stopped answering calls promptly and began letting texts and emails wait unanswered for days. Invitations to dinners or casual meetups I politely declined, citing work commitments or exhaustion. The constant pressure to be available, to be the peacekeeper, slowly faded like a distant echo. The absence was noticed, of course. The cold shoulders, the veiled accusations, the guilt trips disguised as concern. But I remained steady. I couldn't afford to crumble under their manipulations anymore. Alongside this emotional and physical withdrawal, I took control of the digital battleground. I changed passwords on shared family accounts, banking apps, email groups, shared calendars, all secured behind new codes known only to me. This was my fortress now, a necessary barrier between them and my hard-earned assets. Olivia's frantic calls and texts asking for access were met with firm but calm refusals. It was a small victory, but a crucial one. I also updated legal ownership papers for my penthouse. I reached out to my attorney friend and instructed him to file amendments that would block any attempts by Olivia or my parents to claim rights or influence over the property. I couldn't risk another surprise attack like tonight, where my home was demanded as a family entitlement. The deed was locked down tighter than ever, a clear message that my independence was non-negotiable. At family dinners that followed, I maintained a polite distance. I was cordial but detached, participating just enough to not raise alarms, yet distant enough to protect my emotional space. I noticed the shifting dynamics, whispered conversations that stopped when I entered the room, sideways glances filled with accusation and confusion. Olivia's smirks turned to scowls. Mom's attempts to guilt-trip me were met with silence or calm deflection. I could feel the family's discomfort grow as I quietly asserted boundaries they had never respected before. It was exhausting, but it felt like empowerment. I was no longer the invisible safety net or the unpaid caretaker. I was a person drawing hard lines, and while the tension thickened, I knew this was necessary. Behind the scenes, I kept my phone close, documenting every encounter, every veiled threat, every passive-aggressive message. I saved texts where Olivia begged for money, recorded snippets of conversations where Dad tried to manipulate me, and preserved emails that painted a clear picture of my family's expectations and my refusal to comply. Each act of withdrawal was a statement. I was no longer a cog in their machinery. I was reclaiming myself piece by piece, brick by brick. The cost was high: loneliness, anger, and heartache. But the alternative was surrender. Still, despite the cold front I put up, I remained calm on the surface. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. I answered questions with quiet brevity, smiled when necessary, and stayed composed. This wasn't just about survival. It was about strategy. I was preparing the ground for the confrontation I knew was coming, fully aware that my family wouldn't take this quietly. The penthouse was more than a property now. It was my stronghold, the physical embodiment of my resolve. Every action I took to protect it, also protected my dignity. And as the days passed and the distance grew, I felt a new strength rising inside me, a quiet, relentless force that would not be bowed by entitlement or abuse. But even as I pulled back, I was keenly aware of the brewing storm. The family wasn't accustomed to being denied or challenged, especially not by me. Olivia's calls became more desperate, Mom's messages more manipulative, and Dad's tone sharper during the rare calls I allowed. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken threats and veiled ultimatums. Yet, through it all, I held firm. I was done bending. I was done sacrificing. The battle lines were drawn, and I was ready to face whatever came next, armed not just with legal documents, but with the clarity and courage I'd never had before. The next family gathering arrived like a storm I'd been bracing for, a meticulously planned event at my parents' house, filled with the same polished smiles and brittle pleasantries, but now charged with a tension that felt electric, palpable in the very air we breathed. 30 or so guests milled through the grand living room and dining area, their hushed conversations punctuated by the occasional clink of crystal glasses. The scent of jasmine and sandalwood mingled with the aroma of roasted meats, a backdrop to the drama that was about to unfold. I arrived with Ethan by my side, steady and supportive, my heart pounding not with fear, but with the cold certainty of someone who had prepared for battle. The moment I stepped through the door, I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on me, relatives, family friends, even a few acquaintances who'd always seemed unsure how to navigate the undercurrents of our fractured clan. Some faces held curiosity, others thinly veiled judgment, but beneath it all was an unspoken anticipation, as if the room collectively held its breath. The gathering progressed with the usual scripted niceties. I smiled, exchanged greetings, and listened to the customary small talk, all while my mind rehearsed the words I'd planned, the evidence I'd gathered, the boundaries I was about to draw in stone. The penthouse keys, the symbol of my hard work and autonomy, hung like a heavy chain around my neck, invisible to everyone but me. Then, as the evening crept toward its peak, I asked to be heard. I moved to the center of the room, where the low murmur quieted to a hush, eyes turning toward me with a mix of surprise and curiosity. I took a breath, steadying the flood of emotions beneath my calm exterior, and began. "I want to address everyone here tonight about something important," I said, voice clear and firm. "As many of you know, the Penthouse in Chicago has always been my home and my sanctuary. I've worked for years to make it mine, and it represents everything I've built for myself." A few nods, some eyebrows raised. I pressed on. "Recently, I've taken legal steps to protect that home. Olivia no longer has access to it, and I've revised my will to exclude both Olivia and Dad as beneficiaries regarding the penthouse." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. A faint gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by a stunned silence. I held their gazes, refusing to back down. This decision wasn't made lightly. It comes after years of financial support, personal sacrifices, and frankly, painful experiences that have made clear one thing: respect and accountability must underpin any support given. The room tensed. I could see Mom's hand cover her mouth in shock. Olivia's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of panic. Dad's face darkened, jaw clenched so tightly I feared it might crack. I took a small step forward, and then, reaching into my bag, I pulled out my phone. "I have here documented evidence of financial support, messages requesting assistance, and recordings of interactions that illustrate the pattern of exploitation and, yes, even abuse." I paused, letting the weight of that statement sink in, including the incident from the last family party, Dad's slap. Murmurs broke out, some faces flushing crimson, others whispering frantically. Mom's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she opened her mouth to speak, but I raised a hand gently to hold the room's attention. "My intention isn't to humiliate anyone," I said, voice steady but carrying a quiet authority. "This is about setting clear, non-negotiable boundaries. Going forward, any support I provide will be contingent upon mutual respect and acknowledgement of responsibility." The room remained silent, the air thick with tension. Ethan stood quietly behind me, his presence a shield and a reminder that I wasn't alone in this. I felt a surge of empowerment ripple through me, years of pain distilled into this moment of clarity and control. Dad finally broke the silence, voice low and gravelly. "You think you can just cut us out? This family doesn't work like that." I met his gaze without fear. "This family isn't working for me, Dad. Not like this." As the murmurs turned into whispers and sideways glances, I realized the facade was cracking. The polished veneer of our family's image was beginning to chip away under the weight of truth. But I stood firm, unwavering, knowing that this was just the opening move, a declaration that the era of silent suffering, of quiet sacrifice, was over. The boundaries were drawn, the lines clear. The penthouse was no longer just a home. It was my fortress, my statement, my unyielding stand against entitlement and abuse. And as the night wore on, beneath the murmurs and stunned faces, I felt a fierce light ignite within me, a promise that I would never again allow anyone to take what I had earned, or to diminish my worth in the name of family. The moment I spoke, the room erupted, but not in the way I'd expected. Olivia's face drained of the smug confidence she'd carried all evening, replaced by wide-eyed panic. She clutched her wine glass so tightly her knuckles went white, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You can't do this, Reagan," she stammered, voice trembling but desperate. "That penthouse is mine by family right. You're ruining everything." But the panic in her voice only fueled my resolve. I could see the fragile bubble of entitlement bursting. And suddenly, all those years of silent enabling came crashing down around her. That property wasn't a birthright. It was my hard-fought accomplishment, and I wasn't about to hand it over to someone who'd never earned it. Mom's reaction was different, but equally intense. Her face crumpled, tears welling as she clutched at the edge of the dining table, her voice trembling with sobs that sounded both genuine and calculated. "Reagan, how could you? This is family betrayal. We're supposed to stand together. How can you turn your back on us like this?" Her words dripped with a painful blend of hurt and accusation, as if I had committed the gravest sin imaginable. I watched her carefully. Mom had always wielded emotional manipulation like a finely sharpened blade, and now was no different. She was desperate to paint me as the villain, to shift the blame onto me for destroying the family unity she so desperately wanted to preserve, on her terms. Then there was Dad. His face darkened to a shade I hadn't seen before, grief twisted with fury, his jaw clenched with visible tension, the veins in his neck bulging as he struggled to compose himself. "Explain yourself, Reagan," he growled, his voice low but menacing. "How dare you shut us out? This family has given you everything, and this is how you repay us?" The room's atmosphere thickened with hostility. His words echoed off the walls, heavy with accusation and wounded pride. But beneath the anger, I sensed a dangerous undercurrent. A man who felt his power slipping, grasping at control with desperate, unsteady hands. Before I could respond, my phone began to buzz relentlessly in my hand. The screen lit up with a flood of messages and calls. Olivia's frantic texts pleading, "Please, Reagan, don't do this. We can figure this out. Just talk to me. You're breaking the family." Mom's messages followed with similar pleas, veiled threats, and guilt-tripping comments like, "Think of your mother's health," and "We're all hurting because of this." Dad's calls came through too, filled with icy silence at first, then heated demands, and finally bitter accusations of betrayal. I felt the weight of their combined assault pressing down on me, but I tightened my grip on the phone, refusing to be swayed. Ethan, standing quietly beside me, caught my eye and gave a subtle nod, a silent reminder that I wasn't alone in this fight. He whispered, "Ignore them. Stand your ground." I knew the flood of messages wouldn't end anytime soon. They were trying to drown me with noise, to wear down my resolve through guilt and emotional blackmail. Some texts were even disguised as apologies, crafted to lure me back into the fold with promises of change that I knew, deep down, would never come. But I was done responding to their manipulations. I let the calls go to voicemail and scrolled through the text messages without replying. Each one was a reminder of years of entitlement and expectations I'd finally refused to fulfill. Around us, the guests who had been silently watching exchanged uncomfortable glances. Some whispered under their breath, others shifted in their seats, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. I could feel the shifting sympathies in the room, a subtle but growing sense that maybe, just maybe, my side of the story deserved to be heard. The social facade my family had so carefully maintained was crumbling before everyone's eyes. The polished image of a united, loving family shattered by a reckoning they hadn't anticipated. I watched as some distant relatives exchanged uneasy looks, their expressions betraying confusion and quiet doubt. Mom's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she wrapped her arms around herself, visibly shaken but still trying to maintain control. Olivia's face twisted between anger and panic, her earlier sense of entitlement replaced by fear of loss. Dad paced the room, muttering under his breath, the sharp contrast between his public composure and private rage impossible to miss. Yet through this maelstrom I stood firm. I met their eyes without flinching, my voice calm but unwavering when I finally spoke again. "I'm not here to tear this family apart," I said quietly, "but to set boundaries that have been ignored for too long. Respect and accountability aren't optional, they're required." That simple declaration seemed to hang in the air, heavy and undeniable. The clash of emotions, panic, sorrow, anger, had created a storm, but in its center stood one unshakable truth. I was no longer the family's invisible martyr. I was a woman claiming her dignity, and I would not back down. The room remained charged with tension, the aftermath of my announcement rippling through every conversation and glance. No one knew what would come next. But one thing was clear: the old ways were over, and the family's fragile equilibrium had been shattered beyond repair. Weeks had passed since that explosive family gathering, and the fallout was undeniable. Dad's business empire, once a towering fortress of stability and influence, began to show cracks that hadn't been visible before. Without my legal counsel and the steady financial support I had long provided, his companies started to falter. I could see it unfolding in the subtle signs: missed deadlines, abrupt cancellations of meetings, whispered conversations behind closed doors. The man who once wielded authority so easily now struggled to keep his footing. I wasn't naive. Dad's pride was as formidable as his temper. Watching him strain under the weight of his own unraveling was a strange mix of sorrow and vindication. For years, he had demanded loyalty and sacrifice, but the moment I drew boundaries, his empire trembled. It was as if my support had been the invisible scaffolding holding up the facade, and now, without it, cracks spread rapidly. Olivia's situation was even more painfully clear. The first time she called to ask for rent money and I said no, her voice carried a brittle edge of disbelief, a thin veneer of calm barely masking panic. She had never truly faced the consequences of her own choices before. Now she was forced to grapple with the reality of paying bills on her own, the mounting pressure pressing down like a weight she couldn't shrug off. I caught glimpses of her growing desperation in the way she fidgeted during family calls, her usual arrogance replaced by a fragile uncertainty. I heard through the grapevine, muted conversations among relatives and family friends, that Olivia had missed a rent payment once already. A phone call from her landlord had been terse, reminding her that leases weren't to be taken lightly. The woman's patience was wearing thin, and with no safety net to catch her fall, Olivia's world was shrinking fast. Mom, meanwhile, was unraveling in a different way. Her carefully maintained social standing, which had always been a cornerstone of our family's image, began to crack under the strain of mounting rumors and the visible discord. Invitations to charity galas and social events dwindled. I heard whispers of gossip that the Lewis family was not as united as they appeared, that there had been some serious trouble behind closed doors. The image Mom had so fiercely protected was tarnished, and I couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of justice. Desperation led them to try the usual tactics, manipulating extended family members, enlisting distant relatives to intervene, spinning stories that painted me as the villain. Calls and messages flooded through, urging family reconciliation and putting the past behind us. But their attempts felt hollow, lacking the genuine remorse or the recognition that real change would require. Some relatives, however, began to question the narrative. Their eyes looked at me differently now, with a mix of sympathy and curiosity. Sensing the truth beneath the polished lies, I noticed how Dad and Olivia, rather than reflecting on their behavior, doubled down on blame and denial. Dad's messages became colder, edged with accusations of ingratitude and selfishness. Olivia's tone shifted from panic to entitlement masked by false outrage, demanding reasons and explanations for what I'd done. Their refusal to acknowledge their part in the unraveling was a bitter pill to swallow, but it only strengthened my resolve. The community's sympathy was shifting toward me, slowly but unmistakably. Friends outside the family reached out with support and encouragement, affirming my decision to stand firm. I began to receive messages from colleagues, neighbors, even old acquaintances who had long sensed the family's dysfunction, but never knew the full story. Their words were a balm, reminding me that I was not alone, and that seeking respect and fairness was not only justified, but necessary. The physical and emotional distance I maintained from them became a protective barrier. Each day, without the barrage of demands and manipulations, was a step toward healing. I began to rebuild my sense of self, not as the family's unpaid caretaker or punching bag, but as a woman who had claimed her dignity through courage and clarity. Yet, beneath the surface, the family dynamic remained volatile. There were moments when I caught glimpses of the old patterns trying to resurface, subtle digs in messages, passive-aggressive comments during the rare calls I allowed, veiled threats disguised as concern. But the difference now was mine to manage, armed with knowledge, distance, and the unwavering support of Ethan and my circle of true friends. The weeks since that fateful party were a crucible, forging new boundaries and redefining relationships. The Lewis family's fragile facade was cracking, revealing long-buried truths and the cost of entitlement unchecked by accountability. For me, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where respect was mandatory, and my worth could no longer be diminished by silence or sacrifice. As I moved forward, I knew the path wouldn't be easy. The struggle for dignity within a family that had never truly seen me was ongoing. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a quiet strength growing inside. A fire fueled not by anger alone, but by the steady, unyielding demand to be respected and valued on my own terms. The day I set those boundaries was the day I stepped fully into my own power. I laid everything out clearly. To my parents, my sister, and anyone who still claimed to be part of my life. From now on, respect, honesty, and no entitlement would be the only reasons to maintain contact. Any demands, manipulations, or attempts to override my autonomy, they would be met with silence and distance. No more second chances. No more silent suffering. I wrote those terms carefully, sending a letter that was both firm and unyielding. It wasn't about punishing them. It was about protecting myself. For years, I had weathered their storms, absorbing blame and sacrificing pieces of myself to keep an illusion of family peace alive. But peace built on coercion and abuse is fragile and poisonous. I refused to be a casualty any longer. Ethan was my rock throughout it all. His quiet confidence and unwavering support gave me the strength to draw these hard lines. I remember the evening we sat in our penthouse living room, the city lights casting a soft glow through the windows. I sat curled on the couch, hands trembling slightly as I typed out that message, while Ethan held my hand, anchoring me. "You're doing the right thing," he said softly, brushing a stray lock of hair from my face. "They can either respect who you are or they don't get to be part of your life. You deserve that much." His words settled inside me like a balm. For the first time, I realized that my family's approval was not a prerequisite for my happiness or self-worth. That was a revelation I'd been chasing for decades, and it felt like freedom breaking through. The first few weeks after sending that letter were filled with silence, and then a chaotic flood of messages. Olivia's texts ranged from desperate pleas to thinly veiled threats. Mom's calls were layered with emotional manipulation, guilt trips disguised as concern, her voice cracking as she begged me to think about the family. Dad oscillated between icy silence and furious outbursts when I refused to engage. But I stood firm. Each time my phone buzzed with a new message or call, I took a deep breath and reminded myself that this was part of the process. Their resistance wasn't about reconciliation. It was about control. Within our home, Ethan and I began reshaping our life around the peace we were building together. We prioritized our well-being, carving out routines that nurtured us both. Weekend hikes replaced frantic family calls. Dinner conversations were filled with genuine laughter instead of strained small talk. Our home became a sanctuary, not just physically, but emotionally. I also leaned into my circle of true friends, those who had always supported me quietly from the sidelines. Their belief in me reminded me that family isn't only about blood, it's about mutual respect and love. We shared dinners, movie nights, and long talks where I could be vulnerable without fear of judgment. These connections became the soil in which my self-worth took root and flourished. Yet, even as I nurtured this new life, I knew the family ties I'd severed weren't easily undone. I remained vigilant, aware that old wounds could reopen if I lowered my guard. Occasionally, subtle digs appeared in emails or social media posts, thinly veiled criticisms or false narratives designed to provoke. But I was no longer the person to engage or be swayed by these tactics. Instead, I kept my focus on the solid ground beneath me and the unwavering support beside me. Boundaries weren't just lines drawn in the sand. They were walls built for my safety and dignity. And with each passing day, those walls grew stronger, fueled by my determination to never again allow anyone to diminish me. The penthouse, once just a place I lived, became the symbol of this transformation. Its sleek, modern rooms echoed with the sound of my own voice asserting my worth. The keys I carried were more than metal. They were a testament to a woman who had fought and reclaimed every inch of her life. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be without challenges. Family dynamics are complicated, and forgiveness or reconciliation, if they ever came, would have to be on my terms. But I felt a profound peace beneath the surface, a quiet confidence that I was finally living for myself, not for their approval. As I stood by the window one evening, watching the Chicago skyline glitter against the dusk, I felt the weight of those years of silent sacrifice lift. The journey had been painful, but it had led me here, to a place where respect was demanded and given, where love was no longer conditional on sacrifice, and where I was finally free to be wholly myself, no longer invisible, no longer silent, just me, whole, empowered, and unbreakable.